Hi everyone. We'll be starting at 5:30, so please help yourself to drinks and snacks before we get going.
Good evening. Welcome to Walsall. It's nice to see some Walsall faces and some guests here. We're delighted to have you here tonight. This meeting is sponsored by our Global Health Hub. In Walsall, we have an ambition to do more than just educate ourselves, but it is that what we do when we leave Walsall, our students when they leave Walsall and go out and make a difference in the world. And in order to facilitate this, we've established 3 interdisciplinary research hubs, one on gender, one on sustainability and conservation, and one on global health. And those of you will notice that these are not, this is a Venn diagram, this isn't 3 separate groups here. And the idea is that within a college, we have people from across the world. We have students in Walsall this year from 91 different countries. And we have people here from all different disciplines that you could name. And the problems that address us in the world today are problems which require clever people from across the world, from all different disciplines, coming together and bending their mind to those issues. And global health is, of course, one of those. And the very fact that tonight we're absolutely delighted to welcome the famous Fatima Hassan. We're so wonderful to have you here. Who's a human rights lawyer? What's this to do with health? Well, we will find out tonight. And it's about social justice. It's about human rights. It's about medicine. It's about the environment that we give to people. So I want to thank you for stopping by to Walsall on your tour. I hope you have a good evening. I want to thank the organiser of this event for bringing you here. And now I'm going to enjoy myself with my cup of tea, and I'm going to pass you over to our fellow Tolullah Oni, who is going to run this evening's event. Thank you, Tolullah.
Thank you, Jane, and welcome again, everyone, to Wolfson. I'm a fellow at Wolfson College, and I'm been participating in the Global Health Hub, and I'm actually relatively new to Wolfson, and so it's been really, I'm a pandemic fellow, as I call us, became a fellow during the pandemic, and so I'm still super excited that we can meet in person. It turns out this is what colleges do, but I'm like, oh my gosh, now we can do things in person. That's amazing. And it's an honor and a real privilege to moderate and take you through this evening today. I have maybe slightly more difficult than Jane's job tonight, but not really at all, in that I'm just introducing people and getting the conversation going. But we've got some incredible speakers for this evening, and I really encourage you to participate. So for those that are joining us on the live stream, welcome. I don't know where you look. Welcome. And just to point out that we have, particularly for the people joining online, we have a Q&A on slido.com if you want to ask questions in real time, which will be asked here. For those in person, you could do that, but we will also have, there are also post-it notes on your chairs. And so if you want to write notes in real time, questions in real time, and pass them to those 2 people over there, we will collect them just to kind of keep conversations going. Because you hear something sometimes, you think, I want to ask that then. Just write it down and pass it on. We're here because we're still in the middle of a pandemic, right? And not just that, as we enter our 3rd year, we have a situation where we have gross inequalities when it comes to access to vaccines. So while 73% of people are fully vaccinated in many high-income countries, in low-income countries, that figure stands closer to 7%. 3 years in, I don't want to just throw numbers out. I want us to internalize that we're in the middle of something that affects us all, and yet we have this gross injustice when it comes to health access. And we also know that, to some extent, this is surprising, but to a large extent, perhaps not, depending on whether you're glass half full or half empty, because we know this is sitting in the background of huge inequality rooted in colonial histories between low and high income countries that has led to this concentration of wealth and power that have placed public goods in the hands of a small number, so of either governments or corporations in the global north, such as where we sit. So tonight we'll be hearing from a range of speakers about this. So we're going to be interrogating the process of the development of vaccines and the pharmaceutical industry. We're going to be hearing a little bit about the historical aspect of things, not necessarily just vaccines, but medical products and how this has played out in the past, right? So how have we had this? How have these situations in the past played out with pharmaceutical industries making profits at the expense of people's health and people's lives? We'll hear how countries are fighting back and what role critically you can play, because it's such a massive issue, right? So you say, well, what can I do? And that's what's really exciting about today as well. Jane alluded to it earlier, but this event is part of a UK-wide speaking tour that Fatima Hassan is on at the moment, and we're really privileged to host the Cambridge leg of that. It's been organized by a few different organizations come together, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them because I think it's important that you know that this work is going on, right? So it's organized by Global Justice Now, a campaign group working on international issues to challenge the powerful and create a more just and equal world. Global Justice Now mobilizes people in the UK for change and to act in solidarity with those fighting injustice, particularly in the global south. Another organization is Just Treatment. It's an organization campaigning for a healthcare system where private profit is never put before people's lives. So they organize patients to overcome corporate power and win equitable universal access to quality healthcare that everyone deserves. So you can see why you have to know about these organizations, right? We have the Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which is an international student-led organization focused on improving access to medicines for the global community. The activities include advocating for socially responsible licensing at universities, so this is really relevant to where we sit at the moment, highlighting the importance of public funding in the development of medical technologies, and advocating for equitable and affordable access to medicines globally. And lastly, and certainly not the least, by Students for Global Health, a student network and charity tackling global and local health inequalities through education, advocacy, and community action. So there are 25 branches and universities across the UK, including here at Cambridge. So if you're a student here at Cambridge and you're not part of that, I would encourage you to get involved. And they have lots of different activities to really mobilize for a fairer and just world where equity in health is a reality for all. So I thought it was important just to spend a bit of time just to let you know who is behind this, because it links to how you can get involved after this. So the format of this event, we're going to have a keynote from Fatima, and then we're going to have a couple of speakers who I'll introduce in real time, give some remarks about some aspects of this topic, and then we will have a panel discussion that is really open to everyone. So again, encourage you to send in your questions so we can pose them. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Fatima. So Fatima is a human rights lawyer and social justice activist who has conducted public interest litigation, education, training, and legal reform on behalf of people with HIV/AIDS in South Africa through her work with the AIDS Law Project and its primary client, the Treatment Action Campaign. And those who have been who followed then the fight for access to antiretroviral therapy in HIV would recall this organization very vividly. Fatima has litigated against the South African government, private employers, and pharmaceutical companies. She's the founder and executive director of the Health Justice Initiative, a South African-based organization that aims to create a more inclusive and equitable public health system. She's also the former executive director of Open Society Foundation for South Africa. Fatima, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Just such an honor to be invited to Wolfson. Tolullah and I are actually friends from Cape Town, and we go back a long way. So, you know, when she sort of indicated that there'd been interest, I think the organizers, particularly Global Justice Now, UAM, Students for Global Health, and Just Treatment were really excited. So, yeah, I just feel just really honored to be here. So, you know, when you mention that you've got students from 92 countries, I would love to see the map of when each of those countries started their vaccination program. I think the students from those 92 countries, you will see such differences in timing and inequality and divides, and I think it would be a fascinating exercise to see how, by virtue of geography or location, whether somebody from Rwanda who was studying in Cambridge got a vaccine before their grandfather in Rwanda, in the same pandemic, at the same time, in the same world, with the same vaccines. So I want to, oh yeah, and welcome to everybody on the live stream. So, you know, I know Tolullah said I'm going to speak for 30 minutes, so you better warn me when I'm going over time, because I can speak about these issues, you know, forever, because they're just so close to our heart. And they're close to our heart because it's not about like sexy litigation and you get kudos for doing public interest litigation. They're close to our heart because we lost millions of people in our continent because there were life-saving treatments available that were either too expensive or were withheld deliberately by pharmaceutical monopolies. So they weren't available to all people at the same time, and that was the HIV/AIDS crisis. And what we said, the minute the pandemic was declared, and it's about 2 years, we've just had the anniversary of the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, the first thing we all warned about. Well, the first thing we did was we got on a Zoom call and all the HIV/AIDS activists decided that we'd work on COVID again. And that is how a lot of us have come back into this field. But the second thing we said was that the same thing is going to happen again. We're going to be last in line. And that's why I mentioned, you know, let's look at those 92 countries. Let's look at what has actually happened. So I want to title this talk, Inequality and Racism, and what commodification actually has to do with that, all right? And when I talk about the HIV/AIDS crisis, I mention that because we already understood, even before vaccines were being researched, that if something was going to become available in this pandemic to manage it and to take us out of it, we would have the same kind of divides. And we, as Black and brown people in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, would be last in line again. We would eventually get access to treatment, but we would be last in line again, which explains why my godmother, who's 100 years old, kudos to her, only got her first vaccine towards the end of May 2021. First grandmother that got her vaccine in the United Kingdom through emergency use authorization of a vaccine was Christmas 2020. And that is a pattern that has played out throughout this pandemic in the last 2 years. And frankly, we've got here because this is what we've been saying from the HIV/AIDS days and for the last 25 years, that we are currently hostages to a system that is not fit for purpose. You have commodification of medical technologies, not just for COVID, but for HIV, for TB, malaria, cancer, hepatitis B, cystic fibrosis, all of the treatments that one needs to live a good quality life, to get better, not to be sick for prolonged periods of time, and not to die prematurely. And I want to talk about premature death, and that has to be what we think about as we do this work. That system is designed not to prioritize public interest needs, public health needs. The system is designed to prioritize two things: control, and control through monopoly power. And the second most important thing is profit. That's quite simple. $1 million a minute, according to the People's Vaccine Campaign, is the profit of the pharmaceutical industry in the last 2 years on vaccines. Pfizer, between Paxlovid, the treatment that potentially could help us now in terms of treatment for COVID, providing you get a test soon enough, there's some caveats, and its vaccines, could be its blockbuster products, the best-selling products of all time. In the last 2 years alone, or this year and last year, it's estimated that it may make over $29 billion. Okay, so we're not talking about small amounts of money. We're talking about an industry that is infinitely powerful. It is more profitable than the oil and gas industry. So you are up against a systemic challenge that is very difficult. But we've done this before. We've tackled these monopolies in HIV/AIDS, and we've done some work in the last 2 years to tackle some of the monopolies in relation to vaccines, and obviously the battle continues. Because until you can address the systemic issues about the reasons why this power and control was given to this industry, we're not going to go very far. Because frankly, what you'll then be doing is waiting for donations with a very big begging bowl, which is what Africa has been doing for the last year. You can call it COVAX, you can call it the donation begging bowl, but frankly, that's what we've been doing, waiting for drip feeds of charity and drip feeds of supplies. Or you can actually challenge the system to have a sustainable way in which you do two things. You research all diseases, including neglected diseases, and you bring life-saving technologies to the market as soon as possible at an affordable price for everybody at the same time. Now, I mentioned my godmother and the famous grandmother in the UK that got the first vaccine that was administered here, because what is the difference between the two of them? Just geography, right? The one lives in Africa and the one lives in the UK, and that grandmother is the grandmother in the US, the grandmother in Canada, in many other countries where the vaccine program started early enough. Why are we focused on vaccines? You may think, like, this is weird. This is strange. A bunch of activists around the world are so fixated on vaccine access. Because the reason for that, if we just take a few steps back, is that 20 million people have died in this pandemic, at least. The official estimates are 6 million. But the unofficial estimates, according to public health experts, because there's underreporting, deaths are not reported, there's multiple reasons why in many parts of the world you can't count the exact number of deaths. 20 million people have lost their lives in the space of 2 years. It is surpassing the amount of loss in people we've basically lost in the HIV/AIDS crisis or in previous pandemics. This pandemic is not over. I know your country's lifted restrictions. It's crazy. Your admissions are going up. There are new variants circulating, there are new variants being detected and being discovered all the time. And at the beginning of this pandemic, we said, it's not just about fairness and equity that you've got to get everybody access to vaccines at the same time. In this pandemic, if you don't vaccinate everybody at the same time and fast enough, you're going to have new variants circulating and the pandemic will be prolonged. So it is a public health strategy to actually prioritize the vaccination of those most at risk in the whole world, all healthcare workers, then all people over 75, and then everybody else, including people with comorbidities. It's a self-defeating public health global strategy to think that if you vaccinate Canada alone, that they will be immune to COVID. We've seen this with New Zealand, we've seen this with Australia, we've seen this with Indonesia. So the way in which COVID actually evolved meant that you couldn't actually waste time. You can't have uneven timings of vaccination programs. And the reason why we're so fixated on vaccines is because the only way in which you could get out of this pandemic, about $13 trillion of economic loss. People have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their jobs. There's a massive mental health impact. This pandemic has not been easy on anyone. So the material consequences, the socioeconomic consequences, we thought would make people understand, by people I mean global leaders and pharmaceutical corporations, that in order to save the entire global economy, in order to save the entire global public health system, that you would try and do whatever you can to bring the fruits of scientific knowledge to everybody at the same time. That is supposed to be the purpose of human rights, right? What is the point of research? What Oxford University did, or what the NIH did, or Pfizer and BioNTech, or Moderna, what is the point of scientific research if you're not going to make the fruits of that available to the majority of people who are in need? And unlike HIV/AIDS, everybody in the world needed a vaccine, right? With HIV, it was communities who were most at risk, communities who were living with HIV. It wasn't everybody in the world at the same time. And so this was a very different pandemic. And so the emphasis on vaccines was because we didn't find a treatment. We thought maybe remdesivir would be the solution. It wasn't. So in the first year of this pandemic, the only way in which you could minimize suffering and death and loss and try and open up societies and open up economies was actually to vaccinate people as fast as you could. And in places and in countries where they started their vaccination much earlier, they were able to mitigate the impact of the second wave or the third wave. We weren't able to do that. When wave 3 hit South Africa, there were vaccines that had been approved as safe and effective scientific breakthroughs. They'd already started administering them in other parts of the global north, but we were waiting for supplies. And so we faced and we had to deal with and respond to a devastating wave 3. I mean, Marlies is here with me, my colleague from the Health Justice Initiative. We all were affected. We lost friends, we lost family, and that could have been very different, right? We could have started vaccinating in January, February, March, April, May, June. So what happened? We'll come to the issue of the hoarding in a minute. So when I say that the pandemic is not over, I've talked about the number of deaths, but there are 2.9 billion people. I mean, I'm not laughing because it's a joke. I just cannot believe that we are living in a world where 2 years into this pandemic, we know so much. We have some of the best scientists working on this vaccine development. We put public money into vaccine research to accelerate it. By we, I mean multiple governments around the world. We socialize the risk of vaccine development. Operation Warp Speed in Europe, the German government put a lot of money. So the assumption was that we would all put money on the table to develop the vaccines, because that would be one way of taking the world out of this pandemic, a devastating pandemic, that we would all participate in clinical trials. We participated in 4 clinical trials in our country. Marlies was a participant in the AstraZeneca Oxford University trial. So we contributed to scientific knowledge globally, right? There was philanthropists who put money and invested in accelerated vaccine research as well. It wasn't just a private company putting money on the table, and that's an important point, because whose investment was it? It was knowledge in the case of mRNA vaccines, and here we're talking about Pfizer and Moderna. The knowledge of NIH scientists that was used to develop that vaccine. The knowledge of researchers who had worked on Ebola and HIV before for the last 20 years. It wasn't just a technology that was developed in the last year. So those vaccines were developed with considerable public investment and public support, and this idea that we were all in this pandemic together. Who remembers when all those world leaders stood up and said, we offer you solidarity, we're all in this together, whoever finds a vaccine first should share it. Do you remember that, right? So you didn't think that this was going to happen. I mean, I certainly didn't think this was going to happen. We warned that it could, but we didn't think people would be so foolish and so selfish and so greedy that they wouldn't actually make that available to as many people as possible. And so what you had was a situation where by October 2020, and I'm going to give you some dates, before the first vaccine was even considered safe or effective, rich countries, while they were promising solidarity and pledges of support and how we're all in this together, started buying up supplies of vaccines that hadn't yet existed. And it's what we call hedging their bets. Human Rights Watch reported about this and warned already from October 2020 that countries, rich countries in particular, have bought up supplies from multiple vaccine providers. which will explain why in some of your countries you've had a choice. You've had a selection of vaccines. And at the same time, those countries said to us, don't worry, the HIV/AIDS scenario won't play out again. Trust us, we're going to set up COVAX, a voluntary mechanism that will pool resources, buy supplies, and we will deliver the supplies to Africa and to Latin America. And that didn't happen. COVAX didn't even meet, at least half of its targeted supply forecast by the end of 2021, because the supplies had already been bought up. And we warned, when COVAX was announced, we warned and we said the two key lessons of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and any epidemic is never rely on promises, because they're not enforceable. They're not in writing. Never rely on promises and volunteerism. You've got to address the systemic issues, and that's where we come to how monopolies exist and the role that intellectual property plays in propping up what we call patent monopolies. And this is why in October 2020, at the very same time that the contracts were being signed by countries with a lot of money and a lot of resources, that the South African and Indian government went to the World Trade Organization. And this, for us, is the greatest injustice of this pandemic. That the solutions that we had to seek to address these monopolies and get us out of this pandemic so that we could share technology, it's the demands of the People's Vaccine Campaign, share the technology, share the knowledge, lift IP, was that we had to go to a trade body which is made up of member states, which is supposed to be consensus-driven, which props up intellectual property rules and protections, to ask for what's called the TRIPS waiver. So the TRIPS waiver was a recognition from the Indian and South African government that, if we're going to develop these vaccines, which you're already all researching with all of our knowledge and our investment, and if a vaccine does come onto the market, will you have enough manufacturers to make the vaccines so that you can produce billions so that everybody can start getting vaccinated at the same time? We won't be able to do that unless you lift the IP temporarily. And IP is patents, copyrights, trade secrets. So it's about a response about sharing the knowledge of something that should have been a public good. And that's the greatest injustice of this pandemic, that the vaccines became commodified. They were supposed to have been treated as a public good, and they were not. The risk was socialized, but the profit and the access was privatized. And it wasn't all of the pharmaceutical companies' investment and money. So the waiver was proposed and tabled. It started out with 2 countries, South Africa and India. It now has 67 co-sponsors. 100 countries are supporting a TRIPS waiver. 170 former world leaders and Nobel laureates, including Joseph Stiglitz, has said, has the world lost its mind? In a pandemic, you have to lift IP, because how else are you going to have multiple suppliers bringing in as many vaccines as possible to accelerate vaccine programs around the world? And what do you think happened? The same that we had with HIV/AIDS. There was refusal, and the waiver is still being blocked. It's now March 2022. We have the numbers. 2.9 billion people still need a vaccine. Only 13% of all vaccine doses globally have gone to low-income countries, meaning that there are countries who are giving their 4th shot and their 3rd shot, while a healthcare worker in Africa is still waiting for their 1st shot, right? And we have no resolution on the waiver. We had a temporary response from the Biden administration, which was significant, but not enough, where in March of last year, they said, okay, we'll support a partial waiver, but only a waiver on vaccines. And remember, the issue is not just vaccines. We now possibly have treatment. We need to have access to testing. Diagnostics is a significant part of our response to this pandemic. We need ventilators, for example. So if you only lift the IP on vaccines, how do you get all the other technologies also for the global south? So what we have is countries buying up all the available supplies in the system, countries in Africa and in other low-income parts of the world being told, wait for COVAX. COVAX, Father Christmas will come and deliver vaccines to you one day. Never happened. In the entire year, South Africa was waiting for its vaccines. COVAX only sent 1.3 million vaccines. And we had to put money on the table for that contract. Money that we don't have, and now we don't have money for treatment because we spent 10 billion rand on paying top dollar for vaccines from 2 or 3 companies. And then what you have is the waiver proposal. Rich countries starting their vaccine programs, and we are watching on the television how everybody's getting vaccinated, and we're going through wave after wave and death after death and crisis after crisis. And eventually the vaccines start coming in. But they come in on a drip feed basis, and that is what's been happening in Africa, and that is also part of what we have defined as a moral crime against humanity. We've written about this in the British Medical Journal. Because what you do is you say, the VIP customer, the first-class passenger, is the UK and the US and Canada and New Zealand and Australia. You wait your turn. You wait your turn because you're black and brown, frankly. It's racism. Because your life is not as important as ours. Your economy is not as important as ours. But when we will give you supplies, we will decide when they will arrive. So you will wait until we send you the supplies. You can't plan in advance. So in my country, we didn't have a mass vaccination program. We had to do it in ages, in age cohorts. Why did we have to do it in age cohorts? Because there weren't enough supplies. It's called scarcity. But the scarcity is not real, the scarcity is artificial. Because had you dealt with the waiver, had you agreed to share knowledge, then you would have allowed 4 or 5 other manufacturers to help you to scale up with the supplies of vaccines so that we could get more vaccines into the country. So what you have is a situation of hoarding. A lot of people have talked about hoarding of supplies, where you sit on stockpiles because you've ordered from 5 different companies. The UK did that. They disposed of vaccines instead of diverting them in time before they expired to other countries. Or they sent them a week before expiry into a country and expected a country that hadn't even started in its vaccine program to use up, a few 100,000 vaccine supplies. That happened to us. We were waiting and waiting and waiting for supplies, and Johnson & Johnson was not delivering the vaccines, even though we put money on the table, we signed a contract. And they said, well, here's 300,000 donated stock. You can use it for a cohort of 300,000 people, but they expire in 3 weeks. So, when we talk about donations, we also need to look at what was being donated, when it was being donated, and how close it was to expiry date. So the reports you were getting was that we are disposing of vaccines, or countries in Africa were burning vaccines, but they were close to expiry date, or they were expired, or they were basically dumped into some very weak public health system that had to retrofit. But the bottom line is that when you drip feed a country with supplies in a pandemic, and then towards the end of the year, you open the floodgates and you give your excess supplies, you create so much pressure onto the system that it's almost impossible for the country to absorb it. That's not a good public health strategy. You can't drip, 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 gush, gush, donate, expired stock. It simply doesn't work. And that's when we had the CEO of Pfizer and the CEO of Moderna saying, if I tell you, you can basically verify it on Google. But we were told that we were not hard hit, that we didn't really need the vaccines. And even if we'd be given the vaccines, we wouldn't take them because we've been disposing of them. There was 1 or 2 reports about disposal of close to expired stock, or that we were vaccine hesitant. Now, for many of us in the HIV/AIDS movement, we were told we couldn't read time in Africa. ARVs were too complex to take, that we would never be able to run a proper ARV program. And South Africa has the largest ARV treatment program in the world. After many deaths and many losses, and after waiting for years and years and years for generic entries of ARVs. So, the racism, I think, plays out in different ways. But partnered with the hoarding of supplies and the drip feed system, I just call it the drip feed system, was a hoarding of knowledge. And one of the things you have to ask yourself as students is what's worse? Hoarding available supplies to create scarcity in a time of a public health crisis where only 1 in 4 African healthcare workers are vaccinated by the end of 2021, when you have the tools available to vaccinate them, or hoarding knowledge in such a way, knowledge that's not even your own, which was publicly generated through public funds, hoarding knowledge in a way where you prevent others from sharing that knowledge to assist with scaling up production. And that is what happened. So what we found out is we're going through wave 3. We've signed a contract with Johnson & Johnson. We're waiting for the supplies. Johnson & Johnson says, look, we're sharing knowledge with Aspen. We'll give them a fill and finish license, not full manufacturing. So we thought, okay, that's great. Where are the supplies? This is one way of actually helping Africa to get some of the vaccines into the country. None of the supplies arrive, which is why I got Pfizer, by pure luck and chance, because we all thought that Johnson & Johnson was going to deliver on time. What then transpired, the New York Times discloses, is that even on that sharing of knowledge, and this is the same thing that happened with AstraZeneca and Serum Institute, was that they were priority customers. So when I talk about the first-class passenger, is that even with the agreements that we had, the supplies were being made in South Africa after we were told we can't make anything, it's too complex, Africans don't know how to make vaccines. Eventually they agreed for Aspen to do that. Aspen was filling and finishing vaccines in the Eastern Cape. I don't know who's been to South Africa, but in the Eastern Cape. And those vaccines were being shipped to the EU from South Africa in the middle of our wave 3. So, there's a certain irony to the racism and paternalism of, on the one hand, Africans can't do anything, they can't manufacture vaccines, they can't do anything with safety and quality control. And on the other hand, you take those vaccines and you divert them to Europe. About 30 million vaccines were sent to Europe, right? Because they were the priority customer. The same clause emerged in the AstraZeneca. I know that people have celebrated that particular arrangement in the UK. We're not sure why. Because AstraZeneca, firstly, Oxford University gave this exclusive license. AstraZeneca, we don't know why. It was public knowledge, publicly funded, using research universities in the UK. And AstraZeneca then imposed a clause on Serum Institute of India that said if at any time the UK needed supplies, if you had a second wave, if you had a third wave, if you needed supplies, all supplies to anywhere else in the global south would stop, and those vaccines would have to be diverted to the United Kingdom. So it's not just Johnson & Johnson that did that. So the knowledge hoarding basically led to, I think, maybe one of the most promising things of this pandemic, is that unlike the HIV/AIDS crisis, finally the WHO and the South African government said, all right, if you're not going to voluntarily share knowledge with us, or share supplies with us, or vaccinate us at the same time, we are going to set up our own hub. It's called the mRNA Hub Initiative in South Africa, in Cape Town, where I'm from. And we are going to reverse engineer the mRNA vaccines to try and to develop or produce a vaccine using that platform for COVID, TB, malaria, HIV, and any other disease. And what do you think happened? Because we were told in a pandemic, you must recognize, respect intellectual property, and you must ask nicely. Why doesn't governments and the WHO ask the pharmaceutical industry nicely to share knowledge and share technology? And Moderna and Pfizer, who are the two mRNA platform vaccines, refused. So the hub has been operating since June 2021 up until now, and every effort to sabotage it is actually playing out. So much so that a company that was employed by Pfizer BioNTech has gone around to several manufacturers to say to them, don't participate in the hub, and that the hub should be terminated because it threatens the industry's model of developing research for profit and only for certain markets to create market exclusivity. So obviously, the big question is, what is going to happen with the hub? They've made a mini breakthrough. the CEO of Moderna basically just gave an interview, we've just heard this morning, where he said he likened a vaccine to a handbag, to a Louis Vuitton handbag, and said, well, I don't know what they've developed. If somebody says they made a Louis Vuitton handbag, would you believe it's a Louis Vuitton handbag? Wouldn't it look like a fake Louis Vuitton handbag? So we are operating in a model where the CEOs have become billionaires overnight. Stephen Bancel has become a billionaire overnight. So too Albert Bourla and all of the board members and the investors of these drug companies, and are saying things that indicate that Africa has no quality control, no quality standards, likening a vaccine that is life-saving in this pandemic with all this vaccine apartheid and disparities to a Louis Vuitton handbag. We've got Albert Bourla saying that Africans don't need vaccines because they don't want it, and also not many people have died in Africa, right, without him understanding the true context of what is actually happening. And both companies refusing to share any knowledge or cooperate or tech transfer with the hub. And so when people say, shouldn't Africa become self-reliant, shouldn't you rely on local manufacturing, this is what the hub is trying to do. The hub is not just for South Africa. The hub is to benefit technology transfer and sharing in all parts of the world. But here's the irony of the hub, and this is where we need your support. So when I talked about hoarding supplies and hoarding knowledge, there are also companies that decide these countries are not a market for us. So Moderna decided that all low-income countries are not its target market for its really good mRNA vaccine. And by the way, that vaccine actually belongs to the US government. There's a current patent dispute about whose vaccine it really is. So we call that the people's vaccine. We don't call it Moderna's vaccine. So Moderna says it will not supply vaccines to South Africa. It has not submitted its regulatory dossier to our medicines regulator or medicines approver. But what does it do when the hub is announced? It files patents. It has been granted patents. We don't know why our government did that. We're challenging them on that. But it has been granted patents which allow it to exercise a monopoly in a country where it's not even supplying its vaccine, to undermine the work and the functioning of the hub. So if it decides tomorrow it will enforce its patents, the entire hub is at risk. If it decides tomorrow it will not enforce its patent, which it's now said maybe it will, maybe it won't, for 92 countries, then the hub can continue. But deep in that statement, read it carefully, is we will not enforce patents forever, and they get a lot of PR and everybody's writing about this, on the COVID-19 vaccines. So the vaccine technologies that are then developed by the hub for TB, malaria, HIV, all the other diseases that we need this mRNA vaccine for could potentially face legal action or legal censure by Moderna. Moderna needs to drop the patents in South Africa. This is similar to the campaign we've had in HIV/AIDS, where we said to these companies, you cannot be enforcing your patents in our context and in our geography and in our country, because this is actually going to cost lives. This is not about a nice to have. This is not about, aesthetic facelifts, etc. This is about essential life-saving technologies that could actually save lives. So I know that I have like 2 minutes left. I just want to end off by saying that it's a very obviously fast-moving, complicated story to tell, and I can't do justice to it in 25 minutes. But at the heart of this is that the system is not fit for purpose. The WTO is in serious need of reform. It cannot be that we have to find solutions to a public health crisis in a pandemic at a World Trade body, that for 1.5 years, despite 100 countries supporting a waiver proposal, cannot get resolution on it. 7 or 8 countries are holding up that waiver negotiation, including the UK government. And to us, that suggests that these governments, the US, Switzerland, Norway, the EU, UK, Australia, Canada, though Canada has done a bit of a flip and Australia's done a bit of a U-turn, that they are prioritizing IP monopolies in a pandemic over human life, which means that in the next pandemic and the one after that, they are going to do the same. They're not interested, actually, to be fair and honest, in your name. They're doing this in your name because they are elected governments. They are not interested in actually saving lives or making life-saving technologies easily available and accessible. If we do not get resolution on this waiver in this pandemic, and a resolution in a favorable way, then I think our work is going to be infinitely harder as we try and fight for equity in a global health system going forward. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Fatima. I think, gosh, where do we even start? And that's why we've set out a little bit more time to decompress and hear a little bit more. Whilst Fatima is quenching her thirst, I'm going to invite, please keep writing those questions. Are there any questions in the room already? We're going to come onto them in about 15 minutes or so. So do please write them down. I'm going to invite two of our panelists up onto the stage just to follow up directly on on Fatima's points. So I will firstly invite Dr. Emma Glennon to give us an academic perspective, and then I will invite Rhiannon Osborne to give us a student activist perspective. Dr. Emma Glennon is a postdoctoral fellow in the Disease Dynamic Unit at the University of Cambridge. They study the ecology and epidemiology of emerging infectious diseases. They worked with the WHO during the 2018-19 Ebola epidemic, and are now an organizer with Global Justice Now youth and local mutual aid projects such as the Cambridge Community Kitchen. So Emma, I'm going to ask you to pick up a little bit on where Fatima left off, particularly given the context of your work and the perspectives that you bring. Can you reflect a little bit on how some of these issues that Fatima has raised have manifested in other aspects of the pandemic response? Because obviously the vaccine is one aspect of it, and if we're looking at this response altogether, it's important to recognize that. So can you reflect on that? And critically, I think it's important to share with us why you think this might matter for prevention of the next pandemic. Because again, we're talking about the response and how we deal with the pandemic now, but I could see how some of these issues, the systemic issues, could potentially put us at risk or miss the opportunities to prevent the next pandemic. So I'll give you 10 minutes or so to share your reflections, and then I'll invite everyone up on stage whilst Rhiannon gives her thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tolu and Fatima and all the organizers who invited me here. It's really an honor to share the stage here. I've been following Fatima's work from afar for over a year now, and it's just so important. I'm going to talk a little bit about vaccines, but more broadly about all of the things that we need to do to prevent the next pandemic, because vaccines are just one tool of many. And I think it's quite clear that relying on a profit motive to distribute life-saving care during a pandemic is unconscionable. It's quite clear, as Fatima says, that it's not fit for purpose. More than 2 years into this pandemic, 17 months after the original TRIPS waiver proposal, which was led by 2 countries colonized by this one, the UK still refuses to endorse even a limited waiver restricted to the current pandemic. And this is transparently an exercise of neo-colonial control, and it has deadly consequences for the global south, but also here for its own citizens. We've already seen new variants emerge that might have been prevented with equitable vaccine distribution. And these have spread around the world, causing death, disruption, and disability all over, including here. The British government has chosen to endanger millions of lives, including tens of thousands of its own citizens, out of a commitment to the profits of pharmaceutical corporations and nothing else. This is a choice that is self-destructive, and the greed reveals the real priorities of this government. By now it's clear not only that this way of structuring the global distribution of care is unjust, but that it's dysfunctional, and it's incapable of addressing this pandemic or the next. But colonial intellectual property regimes are just one tool of a rotten system. The UK and the US, where I'm from, remain colonial empires with political economies that rely on suffering in the global south and among racialized and working and disabled people in the global north to fuel corporate profits. These are not systems capable of protecting human health. We can see this in the numbers. We can see this in the stories of how, despite having early access to vaccines, despite having the wealth and resources to provide for their citizens, countries like this one have failed to protect their own citizens from COVID-19. Instead, the UK and the US have among the highest per capita death rates on the planet. In the United States, where I'm from, the pandemic has been amplified by internal systems of racism and colonization, for the sake of, as Fatima mentioned, control and profit. With the highest per capita incarceration rates in the world, a racist prison system has demonstrably served to amplify disease, especially among Black and other racialized communities. Indigenous people in the so-called United States have faced about 3 times the death rates of white Americans, with an inaccessible and mostly for-profit healthcare system, a lack of adequate sick pay or workers' protections, inadequate support from the government. COVID-19 thrived in American workplaces as people could not afford to take time off or access testing or care. The UK hasn't done much better. With health and social support systems drained by austerity, the delegation of much of the public health response to corporations like Serco, and schemes to get the economy back on track at the expense of workers' health, not to mention just now pretending the pandemic doesn't exist anymore. The UK is not doing great. And so when we talk about a TRIPS waiver, we often talk about how a failure to vaccinate the global north or the global south has consequences in terms of transmission and variant emergence in the global north. And it's an important point that speaks to the illogic of the distribution system, but it's not the whole story, and it largely still prioritizes the lives of people in the global north. But if you look at what actually happened, it's strange that we don't hear as much about how uncontrolled infection in the global north has exported risk around the world, including in countries that successfully managed their own first waves of the pandemic, and often did so with more limited resources, usually because they actually prioritized the health of the people living there. All of our health is interdependent. There's no way around this with infectious disease. My health affects yours affects mine. And when states like this one orient their pandemic responses around control and profit rather than public health, the whole world loses. We need vaccine equity now. We need trade justice now. We need to develop and fund just systems of research, production, and distribution now. I think Rhiannon is going to talk about this a bit more later. But vaccines are not a silver bullet. This is clear from the trajectories of COVID-19 in rich countries that have focused on vaccines over more equitable and layered public health strategies. And even in a world with just systems for developing and distributing health technologies, vaccines are a fundamentally reactive technology that aren't going to prevent pandemics in the first place. We just can't develop and distribute them fast enough to do that. We have 2 options for doing this: developing universal healthcare systems and core public health infrastructure, making sure that that is everywhere, that everywhere can find and treat and contain outbreaks of new diseases, and preventing those new diseases from coming into people in the first place. I'm going to talk a bit about that because that's my area of expertise. We're living through a period of compounding climate and ecological crises, and this fuels outbreaks of new diseases. Climate change from fossil fuel consumption is expanding the ranges of many diseases, otherwise endangers the health and predisposes people to sickness. Deforestation, such as for animal agriculture, as well as animal agriculture itself, provides ideal opportunities for viruses to jump from animals to people. Mining is another particularly dangerous industry that exposes working people, mostly in the global south, to high risk of infection from wildlife. And locally, people rarely have much choice about their participation in these industries and their exposure to risk. The people working on the front lines are also among the least likely globally to have access to the kind of healthcare that can detect and treat new diseases. So it's in these contexts of ecological and labor exploitation that new viruses are both likely to jump from animals to people and to spread among people without detection or treatment, emerging as pandemics. So the inequality on which globalized capitalism depends creates not just barriers to pandemic control, not just barriers to vaccine distribution, but also creates the very conditions for new pandemic viruses to emerge. I want to illustrate this quickly with a bit of history about Ebola. Although you can see similar patterns in the histories of every emerging disease, as Fatima mentioned, it's really present in the history of HIV/AIDS. A lot of what you hear about Ebola origins and spillover comes down to racist mythologies about people, for example, consuming bushmeat, which is never very well defined. You see this also in racist memes about where COVID comes from. But when you actually dig into the histories of these outbreaks, you see that this obscures the deeper problems, the deeper roots of these problems, which are exploitation and dispossession. The first documented Ebola outbreak happened in 1976 in Zara, which is present-day South Sudan. And it was just a few decades earlier, this happened in the 1940s, that the British colonized the region in a brutal scheme that completely upended local ecologies, human ways of life, replaced traditional livelihoods of the indigenous Azande people with farming and processing cotton for British companies. The first Ebola outbreak that we know about spilled over in the context of this colonial ecological destruction and spread among people in the very cotton factory that was the center.
Speaking, like, actually, when you say that to people, who do they see as their public? Who do they see as the people who should benefit? Who do they see as one of them? And the answer is, like, often just Europe, right? And that was what the kind of the response that we got from both the UK and the EU, arguing over whose public got this vaccine. The EU was like, oh, well, we funded the first bit, which is true. So, like, the broad division is, like, the EU, huge EU funding for the basic research and development and a lot of the background, and then a huge input from the UK government in the last 2 years of development. And what we saw was this like tit for tat argument over like, no, our public get this vaccine, no, your public, no, my public. But it was never like a global public good. It was never actually like, why does Europe have so much money to invest in its research and development systems? Like, where did it get that money, I wonder? It was like my public good for my public, my people, not public good as collective. So yeah, that was just like one last point.
Thank you, Rhiannon and Fatima. Emma, I'm going to pick up on that with the next question to you. I'm going to read that out, and then I'll read the next couple of questions out for those lots so you can start thinking about that. So that's the advantage of writing it down. You get pre-prepared thoughts. Yeah, exactly. Take notes. So a two-parted question of combined. So someone said, well, clearly the current system has many issues. What would a better system look like, and what would it take to achieve this? And relatedly, Emma, isn't a global health body with the legally binding status of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, what is needed to create systemic change? So I'm going to pass that to you first, Emma, just to riff on. But in the interim, I'll read out the next two questions for the other panelists. How do you get countries in the global south who rely on industry to not follow suit, right, in terms of going the same way? And another question, how do you maintain momentum in the global justice movement when you have governments in the global north insisting to return to a normal life? So I'll give you those questions to stew on, and I'll pass to Emma to think about the context of what a better system would look like, because particularly mentioning the WTO, so where is the, I'm not sure the legally binding status of the WTO is getting us much at the moment, and Fatima, you might want to come back to comment on that before the other questions, but Emma, your thoughts on that?
There's so many systems that could be better. I'm not quite sure which one this question is about, but I guess my talk was about quite broad political economic systems. So I'll talk quite broadly. I see there as being two general directions we need to move in. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. I'm not an economist. I'm not a politician. I'm not really interested in being either of those things. But on the one hand, we have systems that are clearly very actively harmful. We have systems of violent border militarization. We have systems that prioritize profit above all else and that put legal backing behind that, behind those priorities. We have so many violent systems in this world that perpetuate the kinds of harms, the kinds of systems, the kinds of logic that I was talking about. On the one hand, we need to figure out what we can do to dismantle these. And on the other hand, we need to figure out what we can do to build up systems that are actually accountable to people, that actually provide care without being trapped by these harmful logics of racial capitalism. So Rihanna talked about a little bit about how these might look in terms of research and development. I think a lot of it does come down to just when we socialize the risks, when we socialize the money, we also have to socialize the goods that come out of them. I think that's like one of the most straightforward things that we need to do. And just like socialize the benefits of these systems and of the vast wealth that places like this have. When it comes to the WTO, I'm not an expert, but I think one of the main issue is that this is a body that's not really democratic. Fatima mentioned there's like 7 or 8 countries at this point that are that have the power to veto this thing that everybody else in the world thinks is necessary. And a handful of countries like the UK are able to block something that is so necessary, that's been so advocated for by the vast majority of nations on Earth. There's something wrong in the decision-making in a body like that that needs to be rethought.
I'm sorry, the question was, don't we need a global health governance body that is just as powerful as the WTO? Because that's the problem. We have the World Health Organization.
Comparing the WHO to the WTO in terms of what it has the
Yeah, but the thing is, the WTO, you sign on and you have to abide by their rules. WHO asks you, oh, this is what we need to do, we suggest these guidelines, and people volunteer to participate, but it's not legally binding. That's an incongruence. That's why the WTO doesn't win over. I mean, that's why the WHO's strategies don't win over the WTO. Right? Like, isn't the systemic change the problem that we don't have a global health governance that's as strong as the WTO in terms of international participation?
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say like one small thing, and then maybe Fatima, I imagine you have something to say. I think, yeah, on that particular question, I think it's important to look at what the WTO does with that incredible amount of power and kind of legal prospect that it has. And I think, like, in any international mechanism, when you have an international mechanism which is set up to, A, enable corporate interference, which is what you get in the WTO, but you also get it in the WHO, you also get it in lots of different food system meetings as well. But B, like any international system where you have so much power and wealth concentrated in the hands of, as you said, 7 or 8 countries, if it's voluntary, if it's legal, it's gonna reproduce those dynamics. So I think it's really hard to say, okay, well, like this is the system that we need, like when the like global north still continues like net appropriation of resources from the global south on like a billions and trillions scale, right? Like when you like land hasn't been given back to people who like live on that land, when like no reparations have ever been paid for colonialism or slavery, when like literally billions are owed because of the damages of the climate crisis, both current and future, and when like a lot of like countries still feel the need to intervene militarily in other countries whenever there's a government that they don't like. So I think that obviously it's a problem that the WHO has limited enforcement power, but I think even when you have legally binding systems, when they are based, and also like when did the WTO emerge, right? It emerged like during like a mass phase of like supposed decolonization to like continue those power structures. So I think when you have systems that are based on those power structures, then even if they're legally binding, they're never going to give us the answers. So it's about like actually how do we dismantle the amount of power that some people have.
Thanks for that important question. I think it would add to that it's not just about legally binding, but legally binding to do what, right? So when people often talk about the WHO, we talk about this, you know, what sounds like this behemoth of an organization, but WHO is firstly made up of member states, which has the same similar skewed in terms of who has a voice and who determines the agenda. But critically, there's certain roles. So legally binding is one thing, but actually what is within your mandate to do. So at the start of the pandemic, it was said, well, why doesn't WHO go into these countries and look at it? It's like, well, it doesn't have a mandate to do that. And actually, as a lot of what needed to be done, it's not just the voluntary nature, it's actually the nature of what the WHO is mandated to do. And the WHO is shaped by the member states. And so this is an opportunity to say, well, what kind of WHO do we want, right? And so maybe linking to the action, like, you know, we are part of the WHO by virtue of the countries that represent us on the WHO, on the General Assembly. So what kind of WHO do we want? Do we want to put together a WHO where you actually, when we have such a global health issue, has the teeth to go in country and to look at data, to anticipate, to pick up early warning systems, and to act for the good of the world in a way that is enforceable? Or do we want a WHO that sits back and sets guidelines and comments and makes suggestions? And I think that it's a fundamental question. There is no, it doesn't go one way. There's nothing predetermined in that. That is shaped by the member states. And I think this does link to the action that is taken locally. So what do you want your government to be saying in your name in terms of thinking about, we actually want a WHO that is able to anticipate, to be able to prevent. We have a new pandemic treaty. You didn't have time to go into that is being hashed out to say, well, how could we do this better? Both from preparedness to prevention, preparedness and response. We are going to have to be honest about what powers the WHO will need to have, or a global health body, the WHO, we need to have, and resourced, right? Because you can't, if you give legally binding powers without the resources, it's just still academic, right? So this is an opportunity to then look and say, okay, what is the kind of, how do we create a treaty that prevents us from getting into this position in the first place where it's preventable, so preventing preventable surprises, as they call them, but also critically when they do occur, that have both the teeth, have the mandate, have the resources to act in the name of, on behalf of the member states. And it's a critical question, and I think it's important that we don't think that it's predetermined. And so when people say the WHO doesn't work, we need another, I don't agree with that, because I think we need to fix, we need to update, and we need to look at what is needed, because you'll otherwise create another that is not fit for purpose. The critical issue is not the WHO, is what they've been mandated to do by the member states. So we need to vote and act, and in the General Assembly, and to push WHO in the direction that actually is more responsive to these global challenges. So do you want to maybe pick up that? And we're running out of time. So just maybe pick up on that, on the last 2 points that I made, because I think that's a good one to end on in terms of what can we do? How do we keep this momentum?
So I think there's two areas of intervention about a global governance framework that would work in a fairer way. The one is the amendments to the international health regulations, and there's work being done on that. The second is obviously the pandemic treaty. Unfortunately, the pandemic treaty process has already been hijacked by language that talks about the protection of IP, right, and not sharing of the public good. So I think there's a lot of work we have to do around that. The WHO, obviously, it's a complex thing. The only good thing in this pandemic is that the WHO found its voice. It didn't in HIV/AIDS, called out vaccine nationalism, vaccine apartheid, and thankfully, the DG of the WHO has been saying, vaccinate all healthcare workers first, vaccinate everybody over 75 first, please divert supplies. And so that messaging from the leadership at the top has really made it embarrassing for G7 and G20 leaders to continue as if it was business as normal. And the WHO is warning, the pandemic is not over. It's not the new normal. We know you're tired, but you still got to practice social distancing, masking, etc. Numbers are going up, deaths are increasing. So, you know, maybe we have to be strategic about where we put our energies into reform. And I think reform has to be the WTO. So a few steps back on the WTO, if I can, just none of us signed up to the WTO